Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this edition of RGU MBA webinar. I am Anita Singh, academic team lead at Aberdeen Business School. And today we have with us Erica Cargill. Thank you for your time, Erica. Some of us know Erica. Erica Cargill is the academic strategic lead at Aberdeen Business School, RGU. Erica heads up a team which delivers business education across a suite of undergraduate and postgraduate level courses, including the school's flagship MBA program. During a career in higher education, which has spanned over a few decades, Erica has witnessed the transition by many thousands of students into this ever-changing graduate work environment. Her research focuses primarily on employability and early career skill development, and the particular skill set of Generation Z employees has now become an important strand of this research agenda. So welcome, Erica. Thank you for your time today, and let's start.
Thank you. Lovely to see everybody, current students, colleagues, former students I see amongst the names. Lovely to be here.
That's good. So as Heather just said, that we will start with a conversation with Erica. You can ask questions on the chat box and we'll take up the questions towards the end. So, well, Erica, my first question to you is, there's a lot of research going on around generations. So why do you think research into generations is so important today?
Well, I thought I would start with some good news because let's face it, we've not had enough good news lately, especially locally in Aberdeen. So the good news is that we are all going to, from now on, experience a 100-year life. According to Linda Grattan's work from London Business School, this 100-year life is what we can all expect. And not only does that mean that we have a much longer period of time to enjoy this life, it means that we have a much longer period to enjoy our working life, which, you know, some of you may greet that with joy and others maybe less so. The other thing about this 100-year life is that actually our period of morbidity at the end of our life is ever shortening. So that sort of last couple of years where we perhaps are in decline and unable to live our life as we would have the rest of the time is very much shorter than ever before. So we can all expect, we hope, a good 90-95 years of productive lives. And whilst we may not choose to spend all of that time working, there will be certainly likely extensions to our working lives. And, you know, as I say, it might not be until we're 95, but we are even already seeing people working into late 70s, early 80s, and not necessarily doing work that they would have done through the majority of the rest of their working life, but certainly doing work that is productive. And what that 100-year working life means for us is that we will experience and are already experiencing this 5-generational workforce. So we have people in the workforce that, as I say, are in their kind of into their 80s, and we also have people joining our workforce. Some might argue even at a younger age than ever before. So graduate apprenticeships being a really good example, where we might have expected people coming into professional roles to come from university and to come in their early 20s, maybe mid 20s, but we now have people coming into professional roles straight from school and studying a degree whilst in the workplace. So that sort of extension of the workforce from the age of 16 up to the age of 80 odd is very much part of what we can already expect and what we can expect going forward into the future. What that gives us is a workforce that is ever more diverse, and as managers and as aspiring managers, as future managers, it gives us certain challenges. Now, the notion of generations was actually initially come up with through marketing. It was marketeers that developed this notion that we could segment people by generations. And marketeers identified that it was quite helpful to be able to develop specific marketing messages that were directly to particular generations. And that has been adopted in other disciplines of business. And we can really sort of see the benefit of not moving on, I suppose, from this equality agenda to a diversity agenda, where we're really thinking about how do we get the best from our employees. One size does not fit all, especially when we've got this hugely more diverse workforce than ever before. And therefore, how do we make sure that whatever stage of your career you're at, you are being challenged appropriately, you are having fulfilling work, and that you are enjoying that working life. I think it's really important to point out, before I go any further with any of this, is that I'll talk about the generations that are recognised, and these 5 generations that I've already mentioned. But do remember that these generations are names. They're not labels. So we will not say, you are Generation Z, so that means that everything about you is, X, Y, is determined. Just like every other I suppose, way of categorizing people. I might say, well, I'm a Pisces, but I don't necessarily display all of the characteristics of a Pisces. I am also I Gen X. I will be very upfront. I was born in the 70s, so my generation is Generation X, and that perhaps gives me some characteristics that I probably will refer to. I'm also, though, third in a family of 4. I am Myers-Briggs type is ESTJ. I'm a resource investigator if I look at Belbin. So there's lots of different ways, lots of different lenses looking at my personality, and generation is just one of those. So I wouldn't want anyone to sort of be thinking that we're putting people in boxes. That would be a discriminatory exercise, which is not a route that we want to go down. But this is a lens through which we can look at our workforce, and through which we can really try to create an environment where we can get the best from our workforce.
So that's interesting. But what exactly is a generation? How would you describe or define that?
So the literature on generations is quite mixed, and I'm not going to say to you today, here are the 5 generations, these are the dates that they occupy, because actually different authors have different sort of time criteria that fit with those generations. However, in broad terms, a generation is a group of people that are shaped by 2 aspects: by key events and conditions in their formative years, and those formative years tend to be towards the late teens and early 20s. Okay, so key events and conditions that have happened in that time for that generation. And then the second aspect that's really important is the input of parents. So we look at what our parents have done, the way that they've brought us up, and we say we like that bit, and we will take that on into our own parenting, and we don't like these other aspects, and therefore we'll try and do it better than our parents did. So you can see that generations are, of course, evolving, and the hope is that current generations don't make mistakes of past generations. But those are the 2 sort of dimensions that you would characterize as defining generations. Generally, although I said I'm not going to put very specific dates to these, but you tend to find that the way that we look at things now, and these 5 generations that I've talked about, a generation will be somewhere in the region of between 12 and 20 years. Okay, so you won't find that a generation will parent the next generation, as you might think. You might just say, my children would be the next generation. In generational research and generational theory, my children would be the generation after the generation that comes after me. So generally, there's a sort of jump in generations, if that makes sense. So, broadly speaking, and I guess, I'm not going to put very specific dates, but we look at these 5 generations, and the very first of these 5 generations would be those that were born generally pre-World War II up until the end of World War II, round about that. And this generation is called the traditionalists generation, or sometimes called the maturists, or sometimes called the silent generation. And this generation were actually named in retrospect. So the very first generation that marketers defined were the baby boomers that came after this generation we're talking about now. And baby boomers, I'm sure you will have heard that term used frequently. So that was when the idea of generations was conceived. And then in retrospect, this generation that came before the baby boomers was named. I think the silent generation probably defines them quite well, because they were the sort of the seen and not heard generation. You have to think about formative years and upbringing. There was an expectation that children would comply. They would do what they were told, especially if you think about through those war years when families were were so so challenged and had such difficulty. So that's a traditionalist generation. The baby boomers, as I've mentioned, were the first generation to actually be named. And the things that happened in the formative years of the baby boomers, so post World War II up until into the 60s, this was a time of economic recovery and of hope, of optimism. So there was the moon landings and the swinging 60s. Suddenly there was free access to contraception, and people's lives completely, enjoyment of lives completely changed. So this time was, as I say, a really optimistic period, and people that went through these formative years in that period came out of that with a consequently a very optimistic and can-do attitude towards life. If we look then to the next generation, Generation X, which is my generation, sort of 70s into the early 80s. This was a time where in formative years there was Thatcherism, there was striking miners, there was the Challenger disaster, there was the Falklands War, and you can kind of see that sort of rise of optimism perhaps was a little bit different for children of Generation X in their formative years. And again, that will have had some impact on their attitudes going forward. We then have our millennial generation, and the millennial generation were the sort of mid 80s broadly up until kind of sometimes the cutoff is 2000, sometimes early 2000s. But this is a group that had experienced 9/11 in their formative years, the Iraq War, the rise of terrorism. So again, some challenging circumstances. But if you remember that this period, this group of this generational group was parented by the baby boom generation, then you can kind of see that where there might have been some negativity around aspects of that, those formative years, the way that they were parented overcame that. And certainly, that certainly is what comes through in the literature. And then we have our most recent generation, our Generation Z, that we're focusing on mostly today. And this is a generation that have had a really rough ride. And we call them Generation Z at the moment, but I wonder if we might rename them the COVID generation. Certainly, that is going to be a really significant formative piece of their history. So we've seen the financial crisis for this group of the sort of 2008 and onwards, more locally 2014 and the drop in the oil price. So this time for this group has, again, it's been challenging to the point that this has become really quite a realistic generation, and certainly that's how they're perceived as. They're also very passionate about climate change. Of course, the Me Too agenda has all happened in this time. So these are the sort of significant and formative things that have happened in their lifetimes. So this is the group that we're talking about through the rest of the evening, and this is the group that are joining our workforce at the moment and will continue to do so over the next few years. We tend to have those coming out of university at the moment might be classed as the sort of tail end of the millennial generation, and generally those that were sort of born 2000 to 2005 are classed as the beginnings of this Generation Z.
Okay, that's a very, very fascinating way of classifying the different generations, with reference to certain milestones in the history. That was very, very interesting. Now, today we are going to focus on Generation Z. From a manager's viewpoint, what can we expect from our Generation Z workforce?
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to flip into a little PowerPoint because I've got 7 key features of Generation Z that I really wanted to share with you, and I just thought that it might keep me on track, stop me rambling if I did it through PowerPoint. So I'm going to just briefly talk through, and if you bear with me, these are the 7 key features of Generation Z that have kind of come through from the reading, the research that I've done into this. So some of these words will look a little bit odd, but I will hopefully explain them in due course. So first of all, phygital living. Now, Digital is nothing to do with being fidgety, for those that are from the Northeast and perhaps know of that word. The notion of digital is very much a fusion of the physical world with the digital world. Okay, so we know that for every physical thing that we experienced in our childhood, there is now a digital alternative. Yeah, so we used to read maps, we've now got Google Maps. Yeah, we used to play with Lego, we've now got Minecraft, and so there is always, you know, a digital alternative. Now, you and I'm not sure, I probably should have asked actually if whether we do have any Generation Zs in the room tonight, but for those that are not Generation Z, they will likely see the physical world and the digital world as separate things, and they will know, of course, that there is always a digital alternative, but they won't necessarily see it as being absolutely kind of merged with the physical equivalent. So, a couple of examples then. And I don't know whether any of you have got teenagers, but certainly in my house, you very often, you find yourself relaxing of an evening and you realise that somebody is on their FaceTime to a friend who is actually pretty much sitting in your living room. Yeah, they might as well be there physically because they're on FaceTime. They can see everything that's going on in your house, and you can in theirs. And whilst that might be a problem for some of us, especially if you happen to be relaxing in your pajamas or whatever, young people don't see that separation. They don't see that there is anything wrong with that you would not have your friend in your living room with you. And another example, my dad passed away earlier this year, and in the preparations that we did for his funeral, we wanted to put together a montage of photos. So we brought out all the old photo albums. My youngest son, who is 9, was looking through the photo albums, and he was trying, if you can see me here, he was trying to kind of zoom in on the paper photographs to see more closely the people in the photographs, and he couldn't see that there was this, that this photograph was different from the one that he would look at on Mum's iPhone. Yeah, and so that sort of inability to really kind of understand the difference between physical and digital, and obviously I'm slightly generalising there. They do understand, but they just don't see that there's a need for a separation between the two. Here's another little, probably embarrassing example. Remember holidays? Yeah, I went on one last year. It seems a very distant memory now, but last year we were travelling to Jersey. We were on the English Channel, and my daughter set me up with a Snapchat account. And this came up, and my eldest son, he's at university now, and he'd gone on a lad's holiday, so he wasn't with us for the first time. So I took a photo of this map showing us on the English Channel, and I sent it to him by text. What a complete dinosaur. My daughter looked at me with utter shock, and she said, "But he can see that, it's on Snap Maps, Mum." And I didn't get that, that Snap Maps was something that just sort of, fused my world with his world, and it was, it was there for him to see. So, another example of this fusion of the physical world and the digital world. So the implications for management practice, and I think that we have, this research, I should explain, was done prior to COVID. It was done kind of the back end of last year. And we have made massive strides in terms of everybody's understanding of this physical and digital fusion. So what I don't want to say is that, all of this is exactly as it was when this research was done in sort of November, December last year. But hopefully you can see that the learning that we've done in this fusion of physical and digital world is really, really going to be key to organisational success. And I don't know how many of you are prefacing some business conversations at the moment with it will be great when we get back in the office, and are sort of still thinking about, let's go back to our normal. I like many others, I'm sure we won't ever go back to that complete normal, but there are lots and lots of things that we can learn from this fusion of physical and digital to really help our workforce and help right across our workforce. Now, this sort of considering the use of reverse mentoring is something that I have mentioned when I've been talking about this research before. Using our Generation Z employees, or those that have really, really captured the ability to kind of work these physical and digital worlds to the organisation's advantage, and reverse mentoring, helping those that haven't maybe got that, that can't sort of, that see that separation, if you like, between the two. recruitment and selection, we are doing it digitally at the moment because we have to. But I suspect that that will extend greatly, and I think that certainly for our Generation Z workforce, they don't see any issues whatsoever with being interviewed on their Apple Watch. That is perfectly okay for them. They don't see that there is any problem with remote working, so they will not even likely expect an office space. And in terms of communication, again, this sort of ever more digital communication, keeping it very short and sweet. And I don't know, how many of you have sent to your kids long texts and got, 2 letters back in response, and this is where we are moving with this this generation, that we don't need to have long and extended digital conversations. So that's our first key feature, is the phygital fusion of physical and digital. Our second one is hyper customization. So this is a generation that are used to customizing absolutely everything. So in my generation, we would have bought a CD because we really liked an artist and we liked 1 or maybe 2 songs on that CD. Why on earth would you spend your money on something that you're going to discard or not listen to 10 of the 12 songs? Yeah, so this generation would never do that. Of course, Spotify is now there, Apple Music, they make up playlists. Everything is very, very tailored to what they want. They don't even really need to think that much about what they are going to purchase, because Amazon will pick up cookies from whatever they've looked at and will say, you like this, what about this? Flipboard will gather together the media that they want to look at. On the right hand side of the picture here, there's a queue. This is not a socially distanced queue. It was before we ever knew of the term socially distanced. This is a queue outside a shop in the Green in Aberdeen. Of young people who are queuing for a limited run of a particular brand of clothing. And it's really just to demonstrate that this generation wants to be able to demonstrate their uniqueness through everything that they do. Yeah, from the music they listen to the things that they buy, to the clothes that they wear. They want to be a brand, and they want to have organisations recognise them for their brand. So where we had Generation Y were quite, they had quite a collective view of working. They very much wanted to work in a team-based environment. We see a much more individualistic approach that our Generation Z are taking. And what they want to do is to be recognised for what they can uniquely bring. Now, this is not so much about a sense of entitlement and saying, this is who I am, you better like it. This is more them thinking, actually, I've got certain skills that I think you could really benefit from. And if you're employing me, let's say you're employing me to be an engineer, but I happen to have been a YouTuber and I've been making videos on YouTube for years. Why wouldn't you use my skills in video editing and promotion, even though I'm employed to be an engineer? Why would you not create a job role that would allow me to use my skills in that to your benefit? Yeah, so it's that, the brand of me, and how do we make organisations be able to capitalise on it, or support organisations to capitalise on it. So hyper customising the workplace then. Some of you may already be in or know of organisations that allow you to pick your own job title. Yeah. So here's a great example of is Brewdog. You can be whatever you want to be. You get a month to decide what your job is, and then you title yourself. I actually was looking at a former colleague's new company website the other day, and his job is dot connector. Okay, so he connects the dots within that organisation, and that's the job title that he's come up with. If I were to think about this, and you can all have a think about it yourselves, I think mine would be Education Ninja. That's probably never been more real than over the last few months, as I've been educating, my students, but also my kids at home. But think about that in relation to your organisation. Do you set out sort of very defined career paths for your workforce? And does everybody know where the next step that they can possibly take would be? And is that right for our Generation Z when they want to maybe come in and not conform to the jobs that you happen to have on offer, but they want to be able to use the full range of their skills to contribute? what that does is, you know, potentially makes performance management a little bit challenging. And again, you know, this is a generation that are used to constant feedback. So any of you that have got kids at school, you will know that you can constantly get, you know, emails from the school, and here's how your child have measured your child's progress over this period of time. Some of my children have been going through SQA exams this year, and you know, putting aside the whole fiasco, actually the fact that teachers were in a position to be able to predict, and that had all of the kind of metrics to their fingertips, I had confidence in that, because I knew that my kids are being measured at every step in the way. The same with universities. You know, we've got a lot of work going on around learning analytics, how our students are engaging with materials, and how that is impacting on performance. So you know, that is again something that we need to have a think about in an organisational environment. If people are coming into the workforce expecting constant feedback and constant kind of measurement of performance, how do we deliver on that, and is it appropriate within our organisation, and how does that impact on the training that might be required? Okay, feature 3 then is realism. And I did mention this briefly when I talked about some of the challenging times that our Generation Z have experienced in their formative years. And you know, obviously, this is a generation that have now had COVID, so they're always going to have the trump card on everybody else. So unlike, you know, perhaps the perception that people are idealistic about the kind of role that they might go into as graduates, and you know, even if I think back in my job to maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where we had our graduate students, our 4th year students, they would come out at the other end and they would be able to select from a number of job offers. Yeah. So you know, they were really sought after. We're not in that situation anymore, and students are very aware of that. They're very realistic about that. They kind of know it's going to be tough, but the good thing about it is that they also know that they've got this 100-year life. They don't necessarily always have to feel that they're in that big rush to get into that first role. And once they are in that first role, they're not necessarily going to be in the same amount of rush to climb the career ladder, because they've got a little bit longer. And you know, the prediction is that they will spend time, yes, of course, in a corporate environment, but they may also choose to spend some time of their career doing something completely different, self-employment, traveling, you know, all of those things, which now the argument would be, if we've got a lot longer to spend working, why not enjoy the things that we want to do along the way. Yeah. So realism, and you know, it's a good thing, I think, and certainly when I've given presented this research to audiences that have included Generation Z, I think they've really appreciated the fact that that you know, this is what's coming through about their generation, that they are very realistic, and that we don't necessarily have to overpromise to get them on board, because actually what they are is really keen to do a good job for us and to get into that career. You know, they really value it and really appreciate it. So I suppose from a kind of recruitment point of view, and in terms of you know, the future of our organisations, thinking about getting involved with Generation Z as early as you can, because they're realistic, but they're also good at planning from an early stage. You know, career planning is something that is embedded from quite an early point in their secondary education, sometimes even in primary education, actually. So organisations are really, you know, may find it valuable to really engage with Generation Z as early as it's possible. Reflecting realistic messages in recruitment activity. We don't have to overpromise, because, you know, realistically we might underdeliver. You know, we know that you're not going to jump in to your first graduate job and be running the organisation from day one. We know that, but you know, a few years ago, our graduates maybe didn't know that, but they're becoming more aware of that now. Thinking about progression focused on skill, and you know, as managers, identifying where those skills are within our employees, knowing exactly where they are able to contribute, and perhaps using that ability to contribute in different ways from our standard job descriptions might suggest. And then just bearing in mind this whole lots of different routes to the same end point, and I know that that is hammered home quite a lot in the media generally at the moment, but it is very much the case, and especially if we think about this longer working life, that you know, students, graduates, young people might find their way in at all sorts of different times, and you know, and I guess thinking about this COVID generation, it is likely to have put a few on a path that they may take a very different direction in a few years' time. So that is our third feature. Feature 4, we economy. So we, you may or may not have heard of this term, but this is the notion of the sharing economy. So Generation Z want to share what they have. And this kind of notion of we economy was actually pioneered by the millennials, and you know, the companies that I've presented on the screen there. These are the organisations that have kind of developed on the back of that idea about the sharing economy. Generation Z want to share their skills, but they also don't see why others wouldn't want to share their skills back. So if we're to come back to that notion of creating your job, so you go into your first graduate job, and you actually are not the greatest at writing. This is not your forte. Writing reports is not the thing that really floats your boat. However, you have got absolutely wizard Excel skills. You're sitting next to somebody who is very good at writing reports. Why would you not outsource the writing of the reports to that person and take on some of their work yourself, because you happen to be better at whatever it is that they're trying to do? Yeah. So again, you know, thinking about that in terms of job role and how that might work within your organisation. And you know, to say that they really want to share their skills, and they don't see why others wouldn't want to share back, and that can often transgress the organisational boundaries. So you know, thinking about your wider stakeholders, they maybe won't, you know, maybe there's sort of a quid pro quo thing that they would see with a client organisation that you maybe would never think about. But you know, why not? Why not share what you're good at and expect some sharing back? Okay, it's kind of the one side of the kind of philanthropy, and the other side of the sort of the external focus, I suppose, and then we've got the we philanthropy, which is the sort of the flip side of that. Now, Generation Z don't really see Greta Thunberg as anything special. What she is just a voice of their generation. So they generally are quite philanthropic in their view, but again, thinking about this sharing idea, they wouldn't necessarily see that it was the right thing for them to express their CSR contribution, let's say, by going and helping out in a food bank for 1 day a week, or by digging a community garden for 1 day a week. Because they might think, well, actually, if I stay in my organisation for that 1 day a week, I can make more money for my organisation than I ever can for this charity. And actually, surely I'm better to earn the money to then pay somebody to be able to support that charitable organisation. So they don't necessarily see it as, you know, they are philanthropic, but they won't necessarily see it as the right way to go out and actually kind of roll up sleeves and take part in some kind of community initiative. Yeah, so they want to do good by doing well. The last point of that slide there, and I think that's just, you know, maybe a little bit of a shift in mindset from our kind of early thinking about CSR. So sharing of skills and resources, but one of the things I suppose for organisations is to just be careful to guard against organisational de-skilling. So if we've got one, you know, whiz at writing reports and they're doing all the reports in the organisation and suddenly they leave, then nobody has those skills. So obviously we've got to be a little bit careful, and we have to be able to develop, especially if we are taking school leavers, graduate apprentices, or graduates into an organisation. We need to be able to make sure that they are becoming a rounded employee for us. But again, bearing in mind where those skills sit. And again, including that kind of wider range of stakeholders in your skill sharing, not necessarily thinking just within your organisation. You know, is there a client organisation that you could you could sort of access some support from and do something in return? And yeah, helping companies by do good by doing well. The upshot. Okay, feature 5 then, fear of missing out. And I think this is quite a low statistic actually. 40% of Gen Z value a working Wi-Fi over a working toilet. It's possibly, in my head certainly, or with my kids a little bit higher than that. But this is a generation who want to refresh their phone every 30 seconds. Okay, so it is a constant kind of worry of what's going on and what am I missing out on. And if you think back to this whole notion of this formative time when your personality is establishing and you are, going through all of those teenage changes, you can see why it's become a bit of a challenge for young people. I don't know about you guys, but certainly one of the lovely benefits of lockdown has been that my teenagers are very much less on their iPhones than ever before, because nobody's doing anything worth looking at, and that's great. And I think that some of them have seen the light a little bit. I don't think that they're all going to turn their back on. In fact, maybe TikTok has taken the place of, they have to sort of had to create their own entertainment. But there is perhaps a little bit of a tide turn. But you can see that whilst we might moan about it, teenagers are always on their phone, it is that genuine fear of what they might be missing out on, what other people are doing, and what they could be doing as well. And if we think again back to the notion of developing the brand, there is that kind of constant competition with others, this sort of feeling of what am I doing to make myself different, and let's just see what everybody else is doing so that I can do something a wee bit different to that. In terms of this kind of notion of development, this is a picture that may resonate with some of your own childhoods, where there was constant bickering in the back of the car when you were traveling anywhere, and maybe those of you with younger children now will see a very different picture, because very often it is the ideal place to give our kids an iPad in the back of the car. You don't hear a peep out of them from Aberdeen to France, as we did a couple of summers ago. But what that has meant is that we don't have the resources to be able to overcome boredom. So, this bickering in the back of the car, the negotiation that happened because, somebody had a book and somebody else wanted it, there is much less of that going on. So the worry is that young people are not good at boredom. They can't cope with boredom, and so when they go into organisations, and I know that we see this within the university, when they come into university, when they go into organisations, they need to be sort of constantly kept busy, and they expect that. We're not always. We talk about edutainment in education terms, that we're not there to entertain them, and sometimes the things that we are trying to get them to do can be a bit boring, and it can require them to really sort of challenge themselves. And it's sort of balancing that with thinking about what might have brought them to this point. And in terms of our management practice, couple of pointers that might be helpful. First of all, Heather actually said at the beginning that she wasn't a multitasker. I'm not sure if your generation said, Heather, you're probably not that far off. But anyway, Generation Z are not good multitaskers, but what they are very good at is task switching. So when you moan at your teen because they are constantly checking their phone when they're supposed to be studying, actually that's less of a problem, because they can look at that and they can come straight back. Okay, so they're good at switching between tasks. But what they can't do is manage lots and lots of different tasks going on at the same time. So how does that impact on how we kind of create job roles and how we allocate projects? Well, we're better to break down big projects into smaller manageable tasks that they can complete, either discreetly and then move on to the next one, or they can work on and then move to the others. But we can't expect them to be working on multiple projects all at the same time, or certainly that's not when they're going to give us their best. Okay. Another consequence, that the internet is fabulous, Google is marvelous, but young people are very, very quick at gathering information. But, and certainly one of the things that we're really challenged with in the university environment is that they need to really stop and learn the validity of what they are generating. This whole fake news agenda has kind of brought that to the fore. But, one of the things that we're very careful and we're very focused on in the university environment is really thinking, how do we help students not just to access information, but to really sort out what is the valid information that they want to rely on for their arguments, and what is spurious information. And that is exactly the same within an organisational setting as well. If you're the first person to come up with a solution, have you thought that solution through, and what is the data kind of basis of that situation? And that sort of considered approach to learning and development, how we approach the learning of our students within the university, but how you approach it in an organisational setting as well, bearing in mind that we need to kind of be constantly reinforcing these skills of ensuring that we're relying on concrete information. Okay, feature 6 then, the do-it-yourself generation. I found this on YouTube, how to build a house in 3 parts. I haven't managed to follow these yet, but young people, they will always find a solution. My eldest moved to university last year, and he's now become a plumber extraordinaire because his bathroom keeps going wrong, and he's learned everything that he knows from YouTube. So we see that this is obviously a really rich source of information for young people, but what we have to be really careful of is that, and certainly within the university setting, this whole notion of from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. We don't stand and deliver to students. Sorry, that was a Dick Turpin reference there. We don't, sort of spout forth and expect students to absorb knowledge. Our role is to guide and to support them through this process of learning to learn, if you like. Okay. Another kind of consequence of that whole do-it-yourself mentality is this notion of a real enhanced interest in entrepreneurial activity. Okay, so again, within RGU, we've got our Startup Accelerator. It's seen unprecedented interest from people who are maybe looking at career changes, perhaps looking to develop that one idea that they've always had. But there's also others that are looking at a second income. Okay, so it's not going to be their primary role, but they will want to do something a little bit different. And that whole kind of entrepreneurial spirit, as organisations, we perhaps have sometimes found that a little bit threatening, but my argument would definitely be that you don't see that as a threat, that you consider that entrepreneurial mindset as really valuable to your organisation, and you think about using it internally if you want to keep hold of your Generation Z workforce. Thinking about openness and honesty, if somebody does have a side venture, then that is a great way for them to develop skills and develop that entrepreneurial mindset, and it might be a way that you can access a particular set of skills or a particular product or service as well. So, and then, the first point, so I've done that slide back from, but that whole notion of supporting Generation Z to source information from robust sources. And that is something, yes, learning to learn is something that we are kind of drumming into to students all the way through their university careers, but it needs to continue once they're into an organisational setting. Final one then, feature 7 is drive, and here is my Top Gun reference. There was supposed to be a second Top Gun movie out this summer, and when I put that photo on the slide, I was very excited about that, but that has not happened, so still we'll look forward to seeing it when it comes. So this whole idea of Generation Z being driven, being realistic, but knowing kind of that they're going to have to work really hard. They're very competitive. They see their brand. They want to make their brand different from everybody else. There is a competitive nature to what they do, and that's in contrast to one of the criticisms that had been levelled at millennials was that this was the generation of the non-competitive sports day. So everybody got a medal, and nobody ever understood what it was like to fail. And we're seeing Generation Z are not that. They have let go of that. Their experience in this quite challenging time in their formative years has made them really realise that they are going to have to fight for what they get, and they're competitive as a result. So really capitalising as an organisation on their willingness to forge ahead, and when it's appropriate to do so. But the kind of caution is guiding our young workforce carefully to ensure that the speed of their approach doesn't kind of overtake their knowledge base. Yeah, they will think that they can rule the world because they've read about it on Google, on YouTube, but we need to guide them, and that's when I talked earlier about reverse mentoring. But this is mentoring the right way around, or the way that we might expect it. And you know, considering the implications for the office environment, because what I focused on in these 7 features that I've talked about here is very much Generation Z. But what we have to remember is that Generation Z are sitting alongside Generation X, Generation Y, our traditionalists, and we have to think about the implications of somebody that's constantly forging ahead and not and coming up with all the ideas and being very competitive. And that's what I mean about thinking about this as not a label, but just a lens through which we can look at our workforce and think about how we might manage them all in a way that's going to help everybody feel useful, feel valuable, and feel that their career is productive. So I've taken you through those 7 key features of Generation Z. I'm happy to revisit any of them if anybody wants to ask any questions of them, but I think we're kind of nearly there. I think Anita, you were maybe going to ask another couple of things before.
These were really interesting features which you were talking about, and the companies can leverage these characteristics to their benefit. I was listening to the features or the characteristics, and I was thinking, I am quite Generation Z. I definitely am not. So, Erika, are these features particular only to those born in these couple of decades, or it's not specific to them?
Very, very good point. Good question. There's 2 quite distinct themes of literature that come through with the generational literature, and it's very, very important, I guess, to point out that that one stream is that yes, these are very defined, and the other stream is that we are actually becoming ever more merged in our generations. So if we think about a world, that we've seen over the last few weeks and months, where grandparents are speaking to their grandchildren every day on Zoom, and they're very much part of their lives because they're seeing them through whatever, FaceTime, Zoom, MS Teams. But if we look further afield than that, we've got people who are maybe in sort of twilight years, twilight working years, as we might have perhaps seen them, who maybe have been made redundant, but before they are ready to be, let's say you're kind of in your your 60s, early 60s, made redundant, but actually this is not something that you're ready for yet. What about an independent venture? What about that entrepreneurial idea that you've always had? And so we see people using crowdfunding platforms, for instance, to generate finance for a business in that kind of situation. We also see, scarily, things like primary school children designing innovations through 3D printing technologies. Yeah, so we've got this sort of merging of the generations, different generations doing things that we maybe wouldn't expect them to do. And so we've got this kind of, yes, this sort of merging together, but I think that the whole COVID thing has given us a really kind of almost a speed up of that process. If you look forward to the expectations of generation research in the future, it is that we are going to move from these 5 generations in the workforce to, and one prediction is that, and in fact it's the prediction by the authors of the text that I've put on the slide there, is that by 2050 we are going to have 14 generations in our workforce. Okay, so the generations are going to get much, much shorter, and that we are obviously the kind of extending of working life will mean that we've got 14. This is really just down to the pace of change, and I suppose I guess if we were to look at it, or to sort of coin the term the COVID generation, we might say the COVID generation are actually those that are, let's say between the ages of 15 and 21 during this period of time, where everything about their future was suddenly thrown up in the air, and you can see how we might find that we kind of almost move on to a completely different set of factors that will influence the generation coming just behind them. So that's the prediction: shorter generations, more of them. on one side, and then on the other side, we are all just becoming a bit more Gen Z. Yeah, that we've all had to master these skills to maintain our relevance, our productivity over the last few months, certainly, and that we be more Gen Z, I suppose, is the message. Now, I've popped up on the slide there, and you might want to write that down, or certainly when you get the recording, you could have a look. This takes you to just a little fun questionnaire that tells you how Gen Z you are. So, I ask questions around how many devices you happen to be kind of working between at any one time. And I suspect that you probably will all be a little bit more Gen Z than you were before lockdown. But have a go at it. You might, it might surprise you as to how different you are to where your kind of generational prediction would suggest. Have a look.
That's interesting. We have a question from Tim, Erica. Tim is one of our MBA students, and he says,
I'm just going to stop sharing that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Tim says he's not Generation Z. One question, how do you think Generation Z and previous generations will coexist within the workforce, say, where older generations are set in their ways with work practices that aren't Generation Z compatible, but making them compatible alienates a previous generation, so basically.
Yeah, and I think that's where, by having an awareness of some of the really sort of useful features of Generation Z, if I can call it that, really, certainly from an organisational perspective, some really useful features, versus some of the features that actually we might want to watch out for, and we might want to kind of keep in check a little bit. You can have then a think about where you might be able to use mentoring versus reverse mentoring, yeah? And by being able to try and balance that, so we know that that our older workforce will want to share knowledge likely with our younger workforce, but they'll find it a little bit difficult to cope with the fact that actually it's not always as well received. But thinking about that from a kind of a mentoring perspective, and putting in place some structure around that to make sure that everybody knows what their value is to the organisation. And I think, again, coming back to this as being just one lens through which we can look at our staff, there are all sorts of other measurement tools and ways that we can consider the contribution that people can make. And it's I suppose it's about thinking about generational research, but also as part of a much bigger awareness of your workforce and what they have to offer, and trying to get that blend right. But I absolutely agree, and I think some of our perhaps more reluctant workforce have had to go through quite a transformational experience over the last few months. And I think that it will certainly be interesting for me as a manager to see, as my workforce come back into the office, how changed people are by what they've gone through.